Well, good afternoon. Today we're looking at Psalm chapter 53, and we're going to begin in verse number 1. It's a familiar verse. Most people have heard this before, but David begins by saying, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." Now, wait a minute here. David didn't say there is no God. He said it's the fool who said there's no God. And it's interesting to me that if you go back to the beginning in Genesis chapter 1, you recall that God had said, "Let us make man in our image." I want you to really think about this. You didn't get here by crawling out of a swamp. And I don't care how often you look in the mirror. I don't care if you see a orangutan or a chimpanzee or a monkey. I want you to know that that's not your ancestor. And you may have had some ancestors that swung through the trees, but it wasn't by their tails. And you need to understand something so very fundamental, that God has made us, He has made the world and everything in it. And while you're back there in the beginning, you'll notice that He made them male and female, and there wasn't nothing in between. And it's really sad the way that America today is so confused about things. It just seems that so many things that are being tolerated and accepted are things that are really unnatural. And so, what you see in this particular verse, that because the fool has said in his heart that there's no God, it's the fool that says this, that you see in rejecting God, you'll see a moral descent. And I just believe it's a tough job for especially young preachers today to get up and preach in communities where people have lost any sense of right and wrong. It's happened before in Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 20. They call good evil and evil good. And so we're living in a time where there's just great confusion. And the problem or the fundamental cause of that is that people have rejected God. And so David begins, and you'll see it's not an intellectual problem as you look here, because as you read further, he'll say that corrupt are they. And that's a tough word. Something that's corrupt is rotten. I don't know if you've ever had something go bad, something decayed, your refrigerator went out, and I'll tell you one thing, something that's corrupt just stinks. I mean, it just really stinks. And so he's talking about these people who are corrupt, and also in the meaning of the word, something that goes sour. And yet, it's amazing how such corrupt smells can become tolerated. We used to live near a town way back in Pennsylvania years ago, and they had a wood mill there. And boy, you could be traveling along, and before you get there, that the smell was just tremendous. I mean, you just wonder how people could live there. You want to know why? They got used to it. And so what we're seeing again, and I don't want to be repetitious, but we're really living in a generation that's moving further and further and further away from God. So we're not surprised how so many things become corrupt and decayed. Now he goes on to say they have done abominable iniquity. And so you can see how far, when a man removes himself from God, he can descend. And then in verse number 2, God looked down from heaven on the children of men. And now a lot of folks think this. They think that that God ought to leave them alone. And God can't leave you alone for a number of reasons. Number one, He's your creator and you're the creation. But number two, He loves man and He wants the best for man. And just think about this. If God would leave man alone, not only would we descend just terribly in the pit, but we really can't live without God. I mean, we really can, and a lot of folks just don't understand that. So he says here that when God did look down to see if there was any that understand, I don't think he's referring again that there's anybody smart enough to figure him out. What he's saying is they have lost every sense of moral judgment. And so what the understanding that God was looking for was morality and spirituality, and he just didn't see that. Now, notice again, and again, there's a much concern about that very issue today, isn't there? In verse number 3, every one of them has gone back, King James, or turned aside or turned away from God, and they all together, look again, have become filthy. And there is none that doeth good, no, not one. Boy, when you look at a world, you go back to Genesis chapter 6, you get a pretty good commentary on how bad things can really get. In verse number 4, had these workers of iniquity. Now remember, keep in mind that he's describing, you see, the character of the fool. And because the fool has rejected God and doesn't want God to have any part in his life, as far as he's concerned, there's no God. He's not looking at it intellectually, but as far as the man goes, he lives without, as if there is no God. Then in verse number 4, they have no knowledge. They eat the people as they eat bread. And it looks like in that phrase that the wicked or the powerful ones, they got the upper hand. I mean, the wicked, oh, I just can't get into that today, can we? Now, they have not called upon God. Now, think how about sad that is. Here they have rejected God. They don't believe God has anything to do with them. They don't want any part of God. And, consequently, they don't have a God to call on. Think about that. There's no one to call on for them. They'll just die without God. In verse number 5, they were of great fear. Now, what he's talking about in verse 5 is that, God's going to deal with it. I mean, no matter how much you want God to leave you alone, he's not going to leave you alone. And if you reject him, he's going to deal with you. And that's what he's saying here. Because here, you see, as you get down further in the text, he's saying that God's going to scatter the bones of him. In other words, God's going to destroy him. And there's consequences, of course, to rejecting God. There really is, and we ought to think a little bit deeper about it sometimes. But out of Zion comes the salvation, verse 6, and only God can do that. What he's simply saying here is, here's people who reject God and are lost, but those who accept God, salvation comes to them. And so those are some fruitful thoughts today, and we ought to ponder them. And we'll continue our study tomorrow as we look at Psalm chapter 54, and I'll see you then.